Hotel Transylvania, 2012, Full Movie Breakdown. Overview. Welcome back to Review and Facts, and today we are checking into one of the most beloved animated comedies of the last 2 decades, Hotel Transylvania. Released in 2012, this film is an American computer-animated monster comedy produced by Sony Pictures Animation and distributed through Columbia Pictures and Sony Pictures Releasing. It was directed by Genndy Tartakovsky, a name that animation fans already knew very well because of his work on shows like Samurai Jack and Dexter's Laboratory, but this was actually his very first time directing a full-length feature film. The screenplay was written by Peter Bainham and Robert Smigel, based on a story crafted by Todd Durham, Dan Hageman, and Kevin Hageman. The film was produced by Michelle Murdocca, with music composed by Mark Mothersbaugh, whose score plays a huge role in giving the movie its playful, gothic, and comedic tone all at once. Hotel Transylvania was made on a budget of around $85 million, and it went on to earn an incredible $358 million worldwide, making it not just a financial success but also the launching point for an entire franchise that includes 3 sequels, television spin-offs, and a dedicated fanbase that continues to grow even years after its original release. The film had its very first premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 8, 2012, before going into wide theatrical release across the United States. Plot details. The story begins in the year 1895, in a Transylvania torn apart by fear and violence between humans and monsters. Count Dracula's beloved wife, Martha, is killed by an angry mob of human villagers who storm their home, forcing Dracula to flee with his newborn daughter, Mavis, into the depths of the forest. Devastated by the loss of his wife and terrified of what humanity is capable of, Dracula makes a decision that will define the rest of his life. He builds an enormous, luxurious, and completely secluded castle resort deep within the mountains of Transylvania. This is not just any building, it becomes Hotel Transylvania, a 5-star luxury resort designed exclusively for monsters, a sanctuary where creatures like witches, werewolves, mummies, invisible men, and every other monster imaginable can escape from the terror and persecution of the human world outside. Dracula raises Mavis inside the walls of this hotel, sheltering her completely from humans, feeding her a steady diet of horror stories about how dangerous and murderous humans supposedly are, all in an effort to keep her from ever wanting to leave. The story then jumps forward 118 years to the present day, where Mavis, now on the verge of turning 118 years old, which for a vampire is essentially the equivalent of turning 18 in human years, is desperate to see the outside world for herself. She has grown up hearing terrifying stories about humans her entire life, but she has also grown curious, restless, and eager to spread her wings, quite literally, since she can transform into a bat. Dracula, meanwhile, is planning an enormous birthday celebration for his daughter, inviting some of the most famous and legendary monsters from around the globe to attend. This guest list includes Frankenstein's monster, known as Frank, along with his wife Eunice, Murray the Mummy, Wayne and Wanda, a married couple of werewolves with an enormous and chaotic litter of pups, Griffin the Invisible Man, and many more classic monster characters, all converging on the hotel for what Dracula hopes will be the party of the century. However, everything begins to unravel when a young human backpacker named Jonathan accidentally stumbles upon the hotel while traveling through the Transylvanian wilderness. Jonathan is a carefree, adventurous, and somewhat clueless young man who has no idea that he has just wandered directly into the one place on Earth that is supposed to be completely off-limits to humans. Panicked at the idea of a human discovering his sanctuary and potentially exposing the location to the outside world, Dracula scrambles to disguise Jonathan as a monster, dressing him up and passing him off as a distant Frankenstein cousin in order to prevent widespread panic among his guests. What follows is a chaotic and hilarious series of events, as Dracula tries desperately to keep Jonathan's true identity hidden while also keeping him away from Mavis, fearing that any connection between his daughter and a human could shatter the illusion he has spent over a century building. But despite his best efforts, Mavis and Jonathan begin to form a genuine connection, bonding over their shared curiosity about each other's very different worlds. As the birthday weekend progresses, Dracula's attempts to control the situation spiral further out of control, leading to moments of slapstick comedy, heartfelt emotion, and growing tension between Dracula's protective instincts and Mavis's desire for independence. Eventually, the truth about Jonathan comes out, sending the monster guests into a frenzy of fear and panic, believing that their sanctuary has been compromised and that a human mob might be on the way to attack them just as one did over a century earlier. Dracula is forced to confront his own deep-seated fears and prejudices about humanity, realizing that his desire to protect Mavis has actually been holding her back from truly living her life. In the film's emotional climax, Dracula must make a choice between clinging to the isolated world he built out of grief and fear, or allowing his daughter the freedom to make her own choices and form her own relationships, even if that means opening the doors of Hotel Transylvania to the outside world. The film ultimately resolves with a message about overcoming fear, letting go of the past, and embracing change, as Dracula learns to accept Jonathan and, more importantly, learns to trust his daughter to live her own life. The movie ends on a joyous and celebratory note, with monsters and humans finally coming together in unity, something that would have seemed absolutely impossible at the film's opening. Cast: Adam Sandler leads the voice cast as Count Dracula, bringing his signature comedic energy along with genuine warmth to the character of an overprotective vampire father trying to navigate modern parenthood while carrying the trauma of his tragic past. Selena Gomez voices Mavis, Dracula's teenage vampire daughter, capturing both her youthful rebellious spirit and her deep love for her father throughout the film. Andy Samberg plays Jonathan, the free-spirited human backpacker whose accidental discovery of the hotel sets the entire plot into motion, and Samberg brings a goofy, likable charm to the role that helps the character win over both Mavis and the audience. Kevin James voices Frankenstein's monster, known affectionately as Frank, playing him as a good-natured but somewhat clumsy giant who serves as one of Dracula's closest friends. Fran Drescher voices Eunice, Frank's wife, known for her loud and boisterous personality that provides plenty of comedic moments throughout the film. Steve Buscemi voices Wayne, the harried father of an enormous family of werewolf children, while Molly Shannon voices his wife Wanda, and together their characters provide much of the film's chaotic family comedy involving their unruly werewolf pups. David Spade voices Griffin, the Invisible Man, adding his trademark sarcastic wit to a character who is, quite fittingly, rarely seen but always heard. CeeLo Green lends his distinctive voice to Murray the Mummy, another one of Dracula's monster friends who helps run the hotel and joins in on the birthday celebration festivities. John Lovitz voices Quasimodo, the hotel's eccentric and food-obsessed chef, whose antics in the kitchen provide several standout comedic sequences throughout the movie. The film also features a talented supporting cast that helps bring the wider world of Hotel Transylvania to life, filling out the hotel with a colorful array of monster guests and staff that make the setting feel truly alive and vibrant. Release date and production background. Hotel Transylvania had a long and complicated journey to the big screen, having actually been in development since as early as 2006, with several different directors attached to the project over the years before Genndy Tartakovsky finally took the helm and shaped it into the film audiences know today. The film premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 8, 2012, before its official wide theatrical release in the United States on September 28, 2012, distributed by Sony Pictures Releasing. It opened in approximately 3,000 theaters nationwide and went on to set a new record at the time for the highest-grossing September opening weekend in box office history. The film's massive commercial success, earning roughly $358 million against its $85 million budget, proved that there was a huge audience appetite for family-friendly monster comedy, and this success directly led to the greenlighting of Hotel Transylvania 2 in 2015, followed by Hotel Transylvania 3, Summer Vacation in 2018, and the fourth installment, Hotel Transylvania, Transformania, which was released in 2022. The original film also received a Golden Globe nomination for Best Animated Feature Film, further cementing its place as one of the standout animated releases of 2012. Full explanation and cultural significance. What makes Hotel Transylvania stand out from countless other animated films is the way it takes classic horror iconography, characters that have terrified audiences for generations across literature and film, and completely subverts expectations by turning them into a heartfelt family comedy about parenting, fear, prejudice, and the pain of letting go. Dracula, arguably the single most iconic monster in all of horror history, is reimagined here not as a menacing predator but as a grieving widower, an anxious father, a character whose greatest fear is not garlic or sunlight but rather the possibility of losing his daughter the same way he lost his wife. This emotional core gives the film a surprising amount of depth beneath its slapstick humor and colorful animation style. Genndy Tartakovsky's background in television animation is evident throughout the film, with its fast-paced visual comedy, exaggerated character movements, and rapid-fire gags that feel distinctly different from the more traditional, polished animation style of other major studios at the time. The decision to root the story in Dracula's trauma from the 1895 mob attack also gives the film's central conflict genuine stakes, since Dracula's fear of humans is not portrayed as irrational prejudice without cause, but rather as the understandable, if ultimately misguided, response of a father who watched his wife die at the hands of the very people he is trying to protect his daughter from. This nuance is part of what elevated the film beyond a simple monster mash comedy and turned it into something with real emotional resonance for both children and adult audiences. The film's exploration of the tension between protecting the people we love and allowing them the freedom to live their own lives struck a chord with parents in the audience just as much as its humor and visual gags appealed to children. Hotel Transylvania also deserves credit for its clever reinterpretation of classic monster lore, taking beloved figures from Universal's classic horror films of the 1930s, Frankenstein's monster, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and of course Dracula himself, and repositioning them as a found family bonded together by their shared history of persecution and their desire to simply live in peace. The film's success at the box office, combined with its positive reception from general audiences despite somewhat mixed reviews from critics regarding its screenplay, proved that there was significant commercial and cultural appetite for reinventing classic horror archetypes for a new generation. This ultimately paved the way not just for its own sequels but for the wider trend of family-friendly monster media that would follow in the years after its release. Even more than a decade after its original premiere, Hotel Transylvania remains a favorite among animated film fans for its unique blend of gothic aesthetic, rapid-fire comedy, and genuinely touching father-daughter relationship at its core, cementing its place as one of the defining animated comedies of the 2010s. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Hotel Transylvania, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to Review and Facts for more detailed movie breakdowns just like this one. Hotel Transylvania, The Complete Story. Chapter 1: The Night Everything Changed. Long before there was a hotel, long before there were birthday parties and monster guests and squabbling werewolf pups running through marble hallways, there was simply a man, a woman, and a tiny cottage nestled somewhere in the misty hills of Transylvania. The year was 1895, and the world outside those hills was not a kind one for creatures who did not look, walk, or live like ordinary men and women. Count Dracula was, by that point in his long unnatural life, already centuries old, a creature who had seen empires rise and crumble, who had watched human villages grow into towns and towns grow into cities, all while he remained tucked away in the shadows, careful, quiet, and largely unseen. But even a creature as old and as careful as Dracula could not have predicted the events of that particular night, the night that would reshape the rest of his existence. His wife, Martha, was the light of his long life, the one soul who had managed to soften the countless years of loneliness that came with being what he was. Together they had a home modest but warm, filled with the kind of quiet happiness that Dracula had once believed was impossible for a creature of the night to ever hold on to. And more than that, they had a daughter, an infant named Mavis, small and pale and wrapped in blankets, utterly unaware of the danger that surrounded her family simply because of what they were. It happened quickly, the way tragedies so often do. Word had spread through the nearby villages, whispers turning into rumors, rumors turning into fear, and fear, as it always does when left unchecked, turned into violence. A mob formed, torches lit, pitchforks raised, ordinary men and women who had convinced themselves that the only way to protect their families was to destroy anything they did not understand. They came for the cottage in the night, shouting, their torchlight flickering against the trees, their voices thick with a hatred born entirely out of fear. Dracula tried to protect his family. He always would have, in any version of that night, in any possible telling of the story. But some things cannot be stopped no matter how much love or how much power stands against them. In the chaos of that attack, Martha was killed, taken from him in an instant, leaving behind a widowed vampire and an infant daughter who would never know her mother's voice, her mother's laugh, or the gentle way she used to hum while rocking Mavis to sleep. Dracula fled that night with Mavis cradled against his chest, running through the dark forest with nothing but grief and fear driving his steps. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that he could not lose his daughter the way he had just lost his wife. Somewhere in the depths of that forest, exhausted, heartbroken, and terrified, Dracula made a vow to himself. He would build a place where nothing like this could ever happen again. He would create a sanctuary, hidden from the eyes of the world, safe from the torches and the pitchforks and the mobs that had taken everything from him in a single night. He would build walls tall enough and thick enough that no human hand could ever reach his daughter. That vow became the foundation of everything that followed. Chapter 2: The Building of a Sanctuary. Grief, it turns out, can be an extraordinary architect. In the years that followed Martha's death, Dracula poured every ounce of his sorrow, his fear, and his love for his daughter into a singular obsession, the construction of an enormous castle deep within the most remote and treacherous parts of the Transylvanian mountains, a place so far removed from any human settlement that no torch-bearing mob could ever hope to stumble upon it by accident. He did not build it alone. Word of Dracula's plan spread quietly among the hidden communities of monsters scattered throughout the world, creatures who had been living in fear and isolation for generations, hiding in caves, in swamps, in crumbling ruins, anywhere they could avoid the notice of humanity. To these creatures, Dracula's vision was nothing short of miraculous, a place where they would not have to hide, where they could simply exist without fear, surrounded by others who understood exactly what it meant to be hunted for the crime of being different. The castle rose slowly, its towers stretching toward the sky, its halls carved and decorated with a Gothic grandeur that reflected both Dracula's centuries of refined taste and his desperate need to create something that felt, above all else, safe. He called it Hotel Transylvania, a name that was equal parts practical and poetic, a 5-stake luxury resort, as he liked to describe it, though in truth it was so much more than a hotel. It was a promise. It was a wall between his daughter and the world that had taken her mother. Dracula filled the halls with enchantments and inventions designed to keep the outside world at bay. Illusions cloaked the surrounding forest, making the path to the hotel nearly impossible for any ordinary traveler to find. Warning systems were built into the very stones of the building, designed to alert the staff the moment any human set foot anywhere near the property. Every detail, every spell, every brick, was placed with a single purpose in mind, to ensure that Mavis would never have to know the kind of fear and loss that had defined her father's life. As the years passed, the hotel became something of a legend among the monster community, a haven whispered about in hushed, hopeful tones by creatures who had spent generations running and hiding. Frankenstein's monster and his wife Eunice were among the first to arrive, having wandered from place to place for decades, never quite finding anywhere they could truly settle down. Murray, an ancient mummy with a surprisingly cheerful disposition despite centuries spent wrapped in bandages, found his way to the hotel not long after, delighted to discover a place where he did not have to explain himself to anyone. Wayne and Wanda, a young married couple of werewolves, arrived with dreams of finally raising a family somewhere safe, a dream that would eventually blossom into an enormous and chaotic litter of pups. Griffin, the Invisible Man, appreciated the hotel for reasons that were, quite fittingly, not always visible to others, while Quasimodo, a hunchbacked figure with an extraordinary passion for cooking, found his true calling running the hotel's expansive kitchens. Slowly but surely, Hotel Transylvania became more than just a building. It became a community, a family built not out of blood but out of shared history and shared survival. And at the very center of that family, growing up surrounded by the affection of monsters who treated her like their own, was Mavis, Dracula's daughter, the one soul in the entire hotel who had never actually chosen this isolated life for herself. Chapter 3: A Childhood Behind Castle Walls. Mavis grew up the way any child grows up, curious, energetic, and endlessly full of questions, except that her childhood unfolded entirely within the walls of a castle her father had built specifically to keep the rest of the world out. She never knew life any other way. To her, the hotel was simply home, its endless hallways her playground, its eccentric guests her extended family, and her father's overprotective nature simply a fact of life, as constant and unquestioned as the sun she was never allowed to see. Dracula raised his daughter with a fierce, almost desperate love, the kind of love that comes from a parent who has already lost everything once and refuses to risk losing it again. He told her stories, countless stories, about the terrifying dangers that lurked beyond the safety of the hotel walls. In Dracula's retellings, humans were monstrous creatures themselves, savage and violent, prone to burning down anything they did not understand, armed with torches and pitchforks and an insatiable hatred for anything different from themselves. He was not entirely lying. He had, after all, lived through exactly the kind of horror he described. But in shaping those stories for his young daughter, Dracula also shaped her worldview, filling her imagination with nightmares of a human race far more uniformly monstrous than the truth actually allowed for. Mavis absorbed these stories the way children absorb everything their parents tell them, as unquestionable truth. She grew up believing the outside world was a place of unrelenting danger, a place she should fear rather than long for. And yet, despite her father's best efforts, despite the endless stories and the ever-tightening protective embrace of a father terrified of losing his only child, something inside Mavis began to stir as she grew older, a restlessness, a curiosity that no amount of frightening bedtime stories could fully extinguish. She loved her father deeply. That much was never in question. But as she approached her 118th year, a milestone that for a vampire carried roughly the same significance as turning 18 for a human, Mavis began to feel the walls of the hotel pressing in on her in a way they never had before. She began to wonder what lay beyond the mountains, beyond the enchanted forest, beyond the only home she had ever known. She began, quietly and privately, to dream of flying somewhere she had never been. Chapter 4: A Daughter's Restless Heart. The days leading up to Mavis's 118th birthday were filled with a strange tension that hummed through the halls of Hotel Transylvania. Dracula, ever the devoted father, had thrown himself into planning an enormous celebration, inviting some of the most famous and beloved monsters from around the entire world to join in the festivities. He wanted nothing more than for his daughter to feel loved, celebrated, and utterly content within the walls he had spent over a century perfecting for her safety and happiness. But Mavis, for the first time in her long sheltered life, found herself unable to simply be content. She loved her father's efforts, she truly did, and she loved the monster friends who had become like an enormous extended family to her over the years. Yet somewhere beneath the excitement of the upcoming party, a quiet ache had settled into her chest, a longing she could not quite name but could not ignore either. She had begun sneaking glances at maps, listening intently whenever a new guest arrived with stories of far-off places, and dreaming, more and more frequently, of what it might feel like to transform into her bat form and simply fly, uninterrupted, towards some distant, unseen horizon. She approached her father cautiously, the way she always did when broaching a topic she knew would upset him. She told him, gently but firmly, that she wanted to see the world beyond the hotel, that she was ready, finally, to experience life outside the protective walls he had built around her. Dracula's reaction was immediate and visceral, an explosion of fear disguised as fatherly concern. He reminded her, as he always did, of the horrors that supposedly awaited beyond the safety of their sanctuary, painting increasingly vivid and terrifying pictures of humans lying in wait with torches and weapons, ready to destroy anything unfamiliar the moment it crossed their path. Mavis, caught between her love for her father and her growing need for independence, reluctantly agreed to stay, at least for now, at least until after the birthday celebration. But the seed of restlessness had already been planted, and no amount of parental reassurance was going to make it disappear entirely. Little did either of them know that the very thing Dracula feared most, an encounter with the human world, was already making its way toward the hidden gates of Hotel Transylvania, in the most unexpected form imaginable. Chapter 5. The Backpacker Who Wandered Too Far. Somewhere in the sprawling wilderness surrounding the hotel, far from any marked trail or recognizable path, a young man named Jonathan was making his way through the Transylvanian countryside with nothing but a backpack, a sense of adventure, and an almost total disregard for personal safety. Jonathan was the kind of traveler who thrived on spontaneity, the sort of free-spirited wanderer who preferred to get delightfully lost rather than follow any predetermined itinerary. He had heard rumors, the way backpackers often do, of strange and mysterious happenings deep in these particular mountains, and being the curious sort, he had decided to investigate for himself, completely unaware of just how significant his casual detour was about to become. As fate would have it, Jonathan stumbled directly through the enchanted barriers Dracula had spent decades perfecting, barriers designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of accidental discovery. Whether it was sheer luck, poor timing, or some strange cosmic inevitability, Jonathan found himself standing at the edge of an enormous, Gothic castle that, according to every map he had ever seen, simply should not have existed in this particular stretch of wilderness. Rather than turning back, as any reasonably cautious person might have done, Jonathan's curiosity got the better of him. He approached the towering structure, marveling at its scale and its strange, almost dreamlike beauty, completely unaware that he had just crossed the one line that Count Dracula had spent over a century ensuring no human would ever cross. Within moments, hotel staff spotted him, and word began to spread through the building with startling speed. A human. Inside the grounds of Hotel Transylvania. On the very weekend Dracula had planned his daughter's most important birthday celebration. Panic rippled through the hotel almost instantly. For the monsters who called this place home, the presence of a human was not a minor inconvenience, it was an existential threat, a potential unraveling of the very safety they had spent generations searching for. Old fears resurfaced immediately, fears of mobs, of persecution, of the violence that had driven so many of them into hiding in the first place. Dracula, upon hearing the news, felt his blood run cold, if such an expression could even apply to a vampire. His sanctuary, the one place in the entire world he had built specifically to keep his daughter safe from humans, had just been breached. Chapter 6. The Desperate Disguise. Dracula moved quickly, driven by a mixture of panic and fierce protective instinct. He could not allow his monster guests to discover that a human had infiltrated the hotel, not during Mavis's birthday celebration, not when decades of careful trust and community had been built on the promise of absolute safety from exactly this kind of intrusion. And he certainly could not allow Mavis, on the eve of expressing her own desire to explore the human world, to discover that a real, living human being was standing somewhere within the hotel's walls. Thinking fast, Dracula devised what could only be described as a wildly improvised solution. Rather than expose Jonathan or risk the panic that would follow, he decided to disguise the young backpacker as a monster himself, dressing him in makeshift bandages and passing him off as a distant, previously unmentioned cousin of Frankenstein's monster. It was an absurd plan built on shaky logic and even shakier execution, but in the chaos of the moment, it seemed like the only option available. Jonathan, for his part, found the entire situation absolutely thrilling rather than terrifying. Far from being frightened by the discovery that he had wandered into a hotel populated entirely by legendary monsters, he was delighted, treating the entire ordeal as the adventure of a lifetime rather than the dangerous situation Dracula perceived it to be. He played along with the disguise, partly out of genuine enthusiasm and partly because Dracula made it abundantly clear that his life might depend on maintaining the ruse convincingly. What followed was an increasingly chaotic series of near misses and close calls, as Dracula scrambled to keep Jonathan's true identity hidden from both his monster guests and his own daughter, all while simultaneously trying to manage the logistics of an enormous birthday celebration that was rapidly spiraling out of his control. Every hallway seemed to hold a new opportunity for disaster, every conversation a potential slip that could expose the truth. Dracula found himself constantly intervening, redirecting attention, inventing increasingly elaborate excuses, all in a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion just a little while longer. Chapter 7: Two Worlds Collide. Despite Dracula's frantic efforts to keep the two of them apart, it did not take long for Mavis and Jonathan to cross paths. Their first encounters were marked by curiosity on both sides, Mavis intrigued by this strange new monster cousin who seemed to know surprisingly little about basic monster customs, and Jonathan captivated by this fascinating young woman who had spent her entire life sheltered within the walls of this extraordinary hotel. As the birthday weekend progressed, Mavis and Jonathan found themselves drawn together again and again, their conversations growing longer, their curiosity about one another deepening with each interaction. Mavis, who had spent her entire life being told that humans were dangerous, savage creatures incapable of kindness or understanding, found herself utterly confused by how normal, how genuinely warm and funny, this particular human turned out to be. Jonathan, in turn, found himself falling for Mavis's spirited, adventurous personality, a personality that seemed entirely at odds with the sheltered, isolated life she had been forced to lead. Their bond deepened during a series of shared moments throughout the hotel, from quiet conversations in hidden corners of the castle to more chaotic encounters involving Quasimodo's kitchen, the werewolf pup's endless mischief, and the general organized chaos of preparing for such a massive celebration. Mavis began to see, for the first time in her life, a version of the human world that did not match the terrifying stories her father had told her. Jonathan, meanwhile, began to realize that the sheltered, seemingly perfect world of the hotel was not without its own complications, particularly a father whose love for his daughter had curdled, over the decades, into something closer to control. Dracula watched this budding connection with mounting horror. Every moment Mavis spent with Jonathan felt, to him, like a direct threat to everything he had built, a crack in the walls he had spent over a century reinforcing. His fear was not born out of malice, but out of the same grief and trauma that had driven him to build the hotel in the first place. He could not separate the memory of losing Martha from the growing fear of losing Mavis, and so he redoubled his efforts to keep Jonathan and his daughter apart, unaware that his increasingly desperate interventions were only pushing Mavis further toward the very independence he was so desperately trying to prevent. Chapter 8: The Party Begins. As the day of Mavis's official birthday celebration finally arrived, Hotel Transylvania buzzed with an energy unlike anything it had seen in years. Monster guests from every corner of the globe poured through its gates, filling the grand halls with laughter, music, and the kind of joyful chaos that only a gathering of centuries-old creatures could produce. Frank and Eunice arrived with their characteristic boisterous energy, Frank's oversized frame occasionally causing minor structural damage as he moved enthusiastically through the crowded rooms. Wayne and Wanda's enormous litter of werewolf pups tore through the hallways in a blur of fur and mischief, delighting some guests and terrifying others. Murray floated through the festivities with his usual cheerful demeanor, while Griffin, true to his nature, made his presence known primarily through sound rather than sight. Quasimodo had outdone himself in the kitchen, preparing an elaborate feast fit for the occasion, though not without the usual mishaps that seemed to follow his culinary ambitions. Amid all this joyful chaos, Dracula tried desperately to maintain control, both over the party logistics and over the ever-growing complication of Jonathan's continued presence. He watched, with a mixture of pride and quiet anguish, as his daughter moved through the celebration surrounded by the community that had raised her, a community he had built specifically to give her the safety and happiness he believed she deserved. And yet, even amid the festivities, he could not shake the growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted, that his careful control over his daughter's world was slipping away, piece by piece, with every moment she spent in Jonathan's company. The celebration reached its peak as the entire hotel gathered for the traditional birthday festivities, monsters of every shape and size coming together in a rare display of unified joy. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though everything Dracula had worked toward, the safety, the community, the happiness of his daughter, had finally come together in perfect harmony. But that harmony was about to be shattered in the most dramatic way imaginable. Chapter 9: The Truth Comes Out. It was perhaps inevitable that the carefully constructed lie could not hold forever. In the midst of the birthday festivities, amid the noise and the laughter and the general chaos of hundreds of monster guests celebrating together, the truth about Jonathan's identity finally began to unravel. A series of small mistakes, careless comments, and unfortunate coincidences converged all at once, and before Dracula could intervene, the entire hotel discovered that the young man they had welcomed as a distant cousin of Frankenstein's monster was, in fact, an ordinary human being who had wandered uninvited into their sanctuary. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Decades of accumulated fear that had driven every single monster in that hotel into hiding at one point or another, surged to the surface all at once. Panic spread through the crowd like wildfire, guests convinced that Jonathan's presence signaled the beginning of exactly the kind of persecution they had spent their entire lives trying to escape. Some guests fled in terror, convinced that a human mob might be following close behind. Others turned angrily toward Dracula, demanding to know how he could have allowed such a dangerous breach of their most sacred sanctuary, especially during a celebration meant to honor his own daughter. Mavis, caught in the middle of this unfolding chaos, felt an entirely different kind of devastation. The realization that Jonathan, the human she had grown so close to over the course of the celebration, had been deceiving her the entire time, hiding his true identity under her own father's orders, struck her with a betrayal that cut deeper than any of the fear rippling through the other guests. She had, without even realizing it, begun to fall for this strange, kind, endlessly curious human, and now she felt foolish for ever believing that connection could have been genuine. Dracula, desperate to salvage the situation, tried to explain himself, tried to justify the elaborate deception as an act of protection rather than betrayal. But his words fell on ears that were no longer willing to listen, not from his panicked guests, and certainly not from his heartbroken daughter. In trying so desperately to protect Mavis from the pain and danger he associated with the human world, Dracula had inadvertently caused her the very pain he had spent her entire life trying to prevent. Chapter 10: Jonathan's Departure. Humiliated, heartbroken, and unsure of what else to do, Jonathan made the difficult decision to leave the hotel, believing that his departure was the only way to undo the damage his presence had caused. He said his goodbyes, awkward and painful, to a Mavis who could barely look at him, still reeling from the revelation of his deception. As he made his way out through the hotel's grand entrance, preparing to disappear back into the wilderness from which he had emerged, the full weight of everything that had happened settled over the hotel like a heavy fog. Dracula watched Jonathan leave with a complicated mixture of relief and guilt. Part of him, the part shaped by decades of trauma and fear, felt a measure of satisfaction that the threat, as he perceived it, had finally been removed from his daughter's life. But another part of him, a part he had perhaps been ignoring for far too long, recognized the devastation on his daughter's face and understood, with a growing sense of dread, that he might have made a terrible mistake. In the aftermath of Jonathan's departure, the hotel fell into an uneasy quiet. The joyful chaos of the birthday celebration had been replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable tension, guests whispering nervously among themselves, unsure of what the future held for their once secure sanctuary. Mavis retreated to her room, overwhelmed by a tangle of emotions she could barely begin to process: grief over the loss of a connection that had felt more real and more exciting than anything she had experienced in her sheltered life, and confusion over her own father's role in orchestrating the entire deception. It was in this quiet, painful aftermath that Dracula finally began to confront the truth he had been avoiding for over a century. His fear of losing Mavis, a fear born entirely out of the trauma of losing Martha, had led him to build not just a sanctuary, but a cage, one that had protected his daughter from danger but had also denied her the chance to live a full and independent life. He realized, with a clarity that had eluded him for decades, that true love sometimes means letting go, that protecting someone does not always mean controlling every aspect of their existence. Chapter 11: A Father's Reckoning. Determined to make things right, Dracula set out to find Jonathan, driven by a newfound understanding that his daughter's happiness mattered more than his own deeply ingrained fears. This was no small undertaking for a man who had spent over a century avoiding any contact whatsoever with the human world. Every step he took away from the safety of the hotel represented a direct confrontation with the very trauma that had defined his existence since that terrible night in 1895. As he made his way through the wilderness in search of Jonathan, Dracula found himself grappling with memories he had long suppressed: the mob, the torches, the loss of Martha, all resurfacing with painful clarity as he ventured further from the protective walls of his sanctuary. And yet, driven by love for his daughter, he pressed forward, determined to correct the mistake he had made and to give Mavis the chance to make her own choices about her own life. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Mavis found herself reflecting deeply on everything that had happened, on her father's fear, on Jonathan's kindness, and on her own long-suppressed desire to experience life beyond the walls she had called home for her entire existence. She began to understand that her father's protectiveness, however misguided its execution had been, came from a place of genuine love and unimaginable loss. But she also began to recognize that she deserved the chance to form her own understanding of the world, rather than living entirely within the boundaries of her father's fears. The reconciliation between Dracula and Mavis, when it finally came, was not a simple or easy one. It required both of them to confront uncomfortable truths, Dracula acknowledging that his need to protect his daughter had crossed into a need to control her, and Mavis acknowledging that her father's fears, however extreme, were rooted in a genuine trauma she had never fully understood. Their conversation marked a turning point, not just for their relationship, but for the entire future of Hotel Transylvania itself. Chapter 12: The Flight to Find Jonathan. With newfound determination, and with the support of his daughter, Dracula continued his pursuit of Jonathan, eventually enlisting the help of the very monster friends who had spent decades building a life within the hotel's walls. Frank, Eunice, Murray, Wayne, Wanda, and Griffin all joined the effort, each bringing their own unique skills and personalities to the increasingly chaotic mission of tracking down a young human backpacker who, by this point, had a significant head start on his journey away from the hotel. The journey was filled with obstacles, both comedic and genuinely challenging, as this unlikely group of monsters ventured further from the safety of their sanctuary than most of them had in decades. Old fears resurfaced for many of them as well, fears of exposure, of discovery, of the human world that had driven so many of them into hiding in the first place. But driven by loyalty to Dracula and love for Mavis, they pressed forward, determined to help mend the rift that had formed on what should have been a joyous celebration. Their pursuit eventually led them to a nearby human town, a place bustling with the kind of everyday human activity that most of the monsters had spent their entire lives avoiding. For creatures who had grown up hearing stories about human violence and persecution, the reality of an ordinary human settlement, filled with people going about their daily lives, proved to be a revelation in itself. The humans they encountered were not the torch-wielding, pitchfork-carrying mob of Dracula's nightmares, but ordinary people, largely indifferent to the presence of a group of unusual-looking travelers passing through their town. This encounter forced Dracula to confront, in real time, the gap between the trauma he had carried for over a century and the reality of the modern human world. While the danger that had taken Martha's life had been real and devastating, the sweeping generalization he had built around that single tragic event, painting an entire species as universally violent and dangerous, no longer held up under the weight of direct experience. It was a humbling and profoundly important realization, one that would reshape not just Dracula's understanding of the world, but the very foundation of everything Hotel Transylvania had been built to represent. Chapter 13: Finding Jonathan Again. After a journey filled with both comedic misadventures and genuine emotional growth, Dracula and his monster companions finally located Jonathan, who had been making his way back towards civilization, still processing the whirlwind of events that had unfolded during his brief but unforgettable stay at Hotel Transylvania. The reunion was tense at first, Jonathan understandably wary of the elaborate deception that had defined his entire experience at the hotel, and Dracula uncertain of how to bridge the gap his own fear and mistrust had created. But Dracula, having undergone his own profound journey of reflection and growth over the course of the pursuit, approached Jonathan with a humility that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. He acknowledged the harm his deception had caused, not just to Jonathan, but to Mavis, and expressed a genuine desire to make things right, both for his daughter's sake and for the sake of the young man who had unknowingly become entangled in a family's century-old trauma. Jonathan, for his part, found himself moved by Dracula's sincerity, and by the obvious depth of love that had driven even his most extreme and misguided actions. Despite everything that had happened, his feelings for Mavis had not diminished, and the opportunity to return to the hotel, to make amends, and to see her again, proved impossible to resist. Together, Dracula, Jonathan, and their monster companions began the journey back toward Hotel Transylvania, united now by a shared understanding that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Chapter 14: The Return. The return journey to Hotel Transylvania was markedly different from the frantic, fear-driven pursuit that had brought this unlikely group together in the first place. There was a lightness to their travels now, a sense of camaraderie that had formed between monster and human alike, forged through shared adventure and mutual understanding. Even the monsters who had initially been most fearful of Jonathan's presence found themselves warming to him over the course of the journey, recognizing in him the same curiosity and openness that had first drawn Mavis to him. As they approached the hotel, Dracula found himself reflecting on just how much had changed in the span of a single, chaotic birthday weekend. The sanctuary he had built out of grief and fear, the fortress designed to keep the world at bay, was about to undergo a transformation as significant as anything that had happened within its walls since its original construction. He was no longer simply protecting his daughter from the world, he was preparing to welcome that world, in whatever limited and careful way made sense, into the life they had built together. Word of Jonathan's return spread quickly through the hotel, and Mavis, who had spent the days since his departure in a haze of grief and confusion, felt a surge of hope and disbelief at the news. She rushed to greet the returning group, her heart pounding with an uncertainty she had never quite experienced before. The reunion between Mavis and Jonathan was emotional and heartfelt, a mixture of relief, joy, and the lingering awkwardness of everything that had transpired between them. Chapter 15: A Celebration Renewed. With Jonathan's return, and with Dracula's newfound acceptance of both his daughter's independence and the possibility of genuine connection between monsters and humans, the hotel erupted into a celebration unlike anything it had seen before. What had begun as a birthday party disrupted by fear and deception transformed, in its final moments, into something far more meaningful, a genuine celebration of unity, understanding, and the courage required to overcome deeply held fears. Monsters who had spent their entire lives avoiding any contact with the human world found themselves, for the first time, extending genuine warmth and welcome toward a human guest, a remarkable transformation born out of witnessing Dracula's own journey from fear to acceptance. Frank and Eunice embraced the newly changed atmosphere with their characteristic enthusiasm, while Wayne and Wanda's werewolf pups, always eager for excitement of any kind, delighted in the renewed festivities. Murray, Griffin, and Quasimodo all contributed to the celebratory atmosphere in their own unique ways, each having grown, in their own manner, through the events of the past several days. At the center of it all stood Dracula and Mavis, father and daughter, finally reaching a place of mutual understanding that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Dracula, watching his daughter's genuine happiness as she stood beside Jonathan, finally understood, in his heart rather than simply his mind, that love sometimes requires the courage to release control, to trust the people we care about to navigate their own lives, even when that means confronting the very fears we have spent our entire existence trying to avoid. Chapter 16: A New Understanding. In the days that followed the renewed celebration, Hotel Transylvania began to change in subtle but profound ways. The rigid barriers that had once completely separated the monster and human worlds began to soften, not disappearing entirely, but evolving into something more nuanced, more reflective of the genuine growth that Dracula and his community had experienced. Jonathan's presence, once considered an existential threat to the very foundation of the hotel's existence, became instead a symbol of the possibility that understanding could triumph over generations of accumulated fear. Mavis, freed from the weight of her father's most extreme protective instincts, began to explore the possibility of a life that included both the sanctuary she had grown up in and the wider world she had always been curious about. Her relationship with Jonathan continued to deepen, no longer built on deception, but on the genuine connection that had first drawn them together despite the elaborate and chaotic circumstances of their initial meeting. Dracula, for his part, found himself navigating an entirely new chapter of his own long life, one defined not by the trauma of the past, but by a hard-won understanding that protecting the people we love does not always mean shielding them from every possible danger. Sometimes, he realized, it means standing beside them as they venture into the unknown, trusting in their strength and their judgment, even when every instinct screams to hold them close and never let go. The hotel itself, once conceived purely as a fortress against the outside world, began to take on a new identity, one that honored its original purpose as a sanctuary for monsters while also embracing the possibility of connection with the human world that had once seemed so uniformly dangerous. This transformation would go on to define the future of Hotel Transylvania in the years and adventures that followed, setting the stage for the continued growth of both Dracula and Mavis as they navigated an ever-changing relationship between the world of monsters and the world of humans. Chapter 17: Legacy of a Single Weekend. What began as a simple birthday celebration, planned by an overprotective father determined to give his daughter a perfect, sheltered milestone, ultimately became the catalyst for a transformation that would ripple through the entire hotel community for years to come. The events of that chaotic weekend, the accidental discovery, the desperate deception, the painful revelation, and the eventual reconciliation, forced every character involved to confront truths about fear, love, and the courage required to grow beyond the limitations of past trauma. Dracula's journey, from a grieving widower who built an entire sanctuary out of fear, to a father capable of trusting his daughter's judgment and embracing the possibility of change, stands as the emotional heart of the entire story. His transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without genuine struggle, but it represented a profound and universal truth about parenthood, that love sometimes requires the painful but necessary act of letting go. Mavis's journey, meanwhile, from a sheltered young woman who had never questioned the boundaries of her world, to a confident individual capable of pursuing genuine connection despite her father's fears, speaks to the universal experience of growing into independence, of learning to balance respect for those who raised us with the courage to forge our own path forward. And Jonathan, the accidental catalyst for this entire transformation, represents the possibility that connection and understanding can triumph over even the deepest and most entrenched fear, that a single individual, approaching the unknown with curiosity rather than judgment, can help dismantle walls that have stood for over a century. Chapter 18: The Hotel Transformed. By the story's conclusion, Hotel Transylvania stands transformed, not physically. Its Gothic towers and grand halls remain as magnificent as ever, but in its fundamental purpose and identity. What began as an isolated fortress designed to keep an entire species entirely separate from humanity had evolved, through the events of a single unforgettable weekend, into something more open, more hopeful, and ultimately more true to the values of unity and acceptance that Dracula had always claimed to hold, even as his fear had once prevented him from truly living them. The monster guests who had gathered for Mavis's birthday celebration returned to their respective corners of the world carrying with them a new perspective, one shaped by witnessing firsthand the possibility of genuine connection between monster and human alike. Frank and Eunice, Murray, Wayne and Wanda, Griffin, and Quasimodo, each having played their own role in the unfolding events of that transformative weekend, left the hotel changed in their own subtle ways, carrying forward a lesson about the dangers of unchecked fear and the rewards of genuine openness. For Dracula and Mavis, the conclusion of this particular chapter of their lives marked not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a new relationship between father and daughter built on mutual respect, honest communication, and a shared understanding that love and protection do not always have to mean the same thing. Their bond, tested and ultimately strengthened by the events of that chaotic birthday weekend, would go on to be tested again and again in the years that followed, as Mavis continued to explore the wider world and Dracula continued to grapple with the ongoing challenge of balancing his protective instincts with his daughter's growing independence. And Jonathan, having found his way into this extraordinary world quite by accident, found himself welcomed, ultimately, not as an intruder or a threat, but as a genuine part of the strange, wonderful, and deeply loving family that had formed within the walls of Hotel Transylvania, a family bound together not by blood or species, but by shared history, mutual respect, and the courage to overcome the fears that had once kept them apart. In the end, the story of Hotel Transylvania is not simply a comedic tale of monsters and mistaken identities, but a deeply human story, in every sense of the word, about the ways fear can shape and distort our understanding of the world, and about the courage it takes to move beyond that fear toward genuine connection, understanding, and love. It is a story about a father learning to let go, a daughter learning to find her own voice, and an entire community learning that the walls we build to protect ourselves can, if we are brave enough, eventually become bridges toward a better and more open future. Chapter 19: The Small Moments That Mattered. Looking back on the events of that unforgettable weekend, it becomes clear that the true heart of the story was never found in its most dramatic set pieces, the panicked chases through hotel corridors, the frantic disguises, or the desperate journey to bring Jonathan back. Instead, the real emotional weight of the story lived in its smaller, quieter moments, the ones easy to overlook amid all the chaos and comedy. It was in the quiet conversation between Mavis and Jonathan on a moonlit balcony, where she first admitted, hesitantly, that she had always wondered what the sunrise looked like despite never having been allowed to see one. It was in the brief, unguarded moment when Dracula watched his daughter laugh freely, genuinely, in a way he realized he had not seen in far too long, and felt the first crack form in his carefully constructed resolve to keep her sheltered forever. It was in Frank's clumsy but heartfelt attempt to comfort Dracula after Jonathan's departure, a reminder that even in a community built around slapstick and chaos, genuine friendship and support existed beneath the surface. These smaller moments mattered because they revealed the characters as more than simply comedic archetypes built around visual gags and monster stereotypes. Dracula was not merely an overprotective father played for laughs. He was a widower still carrying the unresolved grief of a tragedy that had defined the last century of his existence. Mavis was not simply a rebellious teenager eager to break free of parental control. She was a young woman genuinely torn between love and loyalty to the father who raised her, and a growing need to discover who she might become outside the walls he had built around her. And Jonathan, far from being a simple comic relief human stumbling into a world he did not understand, represented an openness and curiosity that stood in direct contrast to the fear that had shaped so much of the hotel's history. Chapter 20: The Weight of Inherited Fear. One of the more understated but deeply important threads running through the entire story is the idea of inherited fear, the way trauma experienced by one generation can shape, and sometimes distort, the worldview of the generation that follows. Mavis never witnessed the mob attack that killed her mother. She never experienced, firsthand, the violence and hatred that drove her father into isolation. And yet, through the countless stories Dracula told her throughout her childhood, she absorbed that fear as though it were her own lived experience, carrying the weight of a trauma that technically belonged to her father, not to her. This dynamic speaks to something universally recognizable: the way parents, in their attempt to protect their children from repeating painful experiences, sometimes inadvertently pass down the emotional weight of those experiences instead. Dracula's stories were not lies exactly, they were rooted in a genuine and devastating loss, but in retelling them so often and so vividly, he had unintentionally built an entire worldview for his daughter based on a single, tragic exception rather than the broader, more complicated truth of human nature. Mavis's eventual journey toward independence was not simply about rebelling against her father's rules, it was about learning to form her own understanding of the world, separate from the fears she had inherited but never personally experienced. This theme reaches its resolution in the moment Dracula finally ventures beyond the hotel walls himself, forcing him to confront the gap between the trauma he had carried for so long and the reality of the modern world around him. In doing so, he does not erase or dismiss the pain of what happened to Martha. That loss remains real and permanent, but he begins to separate that specific, devastating tragedy from a sweeping judgment about an entire species, allowing both himself and his daughter the chance to build a more nuanced, more hopeful understanding of the world moving forward. Chapter 21: The Community Behind the Walls. While Dracula and Mavis's relationship forms the emotional core of the story, the wider community of monsters who call Hotel Transylvania home plays an equally important role in shaping the film's overall message. Frank and Eunice, Wayne and Wanda, Murray, Griffin, and Quasimodo are not simply comic relief characters filling out the background of Dracula's story. They represent an entire generation of monsters who found in Hotel Transylvania something they had been searching for their entire lives: a place to simply exist without fear. Each of these characters carries their own history of persecution and isolation, histories that are only lightly touched upon throughout the story but that inform their reactions during the crisis surrounding Jonathan's discovery. Their panic upon learning of a human's presence within the hotel is not simply comedic overreaction. It is a genuine and understandable response rooted in generations of hiding, running, and fearing exactly this kind of exposure. And their eventual willingness to embrace change, to extend warmth and welcome toward Jonathan by the story's conclusion, mirrors Dracula's own journey on a smaller, communal scale. This collective transformation reinforces one of the story's central messages, that fear, however deeply rooted and however justified by past experience, does not have to remain permanent. Communities, like individuals, are capable of growth, of learning to extend trust even after generations of justified caution, provided they are given genuine reasons to believe that such trust might be rewarded rather than betrayed. Chapter 22: What the Story Leaves US with. By its conclusion, Hotel Transylvania offers its audience far more than a simple, comedic tale of mistaken identity and monster mayhem. It offers a genuinely moving meditation on the complicated, often contradictory nature of love, particularly the love between parents and children. It explores how the desire to protect the people we love can, if left unchecked, become indistinguishable from control, and how genuine love sometimes requires the painful courage to release that control, to trust the people we care about to navigate their own path, even when every instinct urges us to hold them close and shield them from every possible danger. The story also offers a hopeful, if not entirely simplistic, message about the possibility of overcoming deeply entrenched fear and prejudice. Dracula's transformation from a man who built an entire fortress out of grief and fear, to a father capable of welcoming a human into his daughter's life, does not happen instantly, and it does not erase the very real pain of what he lost. But it demonstrates that even the most deeply held fears, born from genuine and devastating experience, do not have to remain permanent barriers to connection and growth. Ultimately, Hotel Transylvania endures, more than a decade after its original release, because beneath its colorful animation, its rapid-fire jokes, and its endless parade of classic monster characters, it tells a story that resonates far beyond the world of vampires and werewolves. It is a story about the walls we build to protect ourselves and the people we love, and about the courage it takes to eventually open the gates, even just a little, to let the wider world in. Hotel Transylvania, 2012, The Life Histories of the Cast. Adam Sandler. Adam Sandler, the voice behind Count Dracula, was born on September 9, 1966, in Brooklyn, New York, the youngest of 4 children in a Jewish family. His mother, Judy, worked as a nursery school teacher, while his father, Stanley, was an electrical engineer, and it was this warm, working-class household that shaped much of the humor Sandler would later bring to his career. When Adam was around 6 years old, his family relocated from Brooklyn to Manchester, New Hampshire, and it was in this quieter, more suburban setting that he spent the majority of his childhood, attending Manchester Central High School, where classmates and teachers alike began to notice his natural gift for making people laugh. Encouraged by his older brother, Sandler first tried stand-up comedy at the age of 17, taking the stage at a club in Boston, and despite admitting in later interviews that he battled genuine stage fright during those early performances, often relying on his guitar as a kind of security blanket to steady his nerves, he quickly discovered that comedy was where he belonged. He went on to study at New York University, ultimately graduating from the Tisch School of the Arts with a degree in acting, all while continuing to hone his stand-up act in the comedy clubs scattered throughout New York City, frequently performing for little more than $10 a night, a sum he later recalled with a certain nostalgic fondness given everything that followed. His talent did not go unnoticed for long. Comedian Dennis Miller caught one of Sandler's sets in Los Angeles and recommended him to the producers of Saturday Night Live, a recommendation that led to Sandler joining the show first as a writer in 1990 and then as a full cast member the following year. His time on Saturday Night Live proved transformative, allowing him to develop a series of beloved characters and musical bits, including holiday novelty songs that remain fan favorites decades later, cementing his reputation as one of the most distinctive comedic voices of his generation. After leaving the show in the mid-1990s, Sandler transitioned into a remarkably successful film career, starring in and often co-writing a string of comedies that defined an entire era of American humor, characterized by an everyman charm, an unpretentious sense of humor, and characters who, however goofy, always carried a certain warmth and sincerity beneath the surface. Beyond his purely comedic work, Sandler has also proven himself a genuinely gifted dramatic actor over the years, taking on more serious and emotionally complex roles that showcase the different, more introspective side of his talent, roles that earned him significant critical acclaim and repositioned him, in the eyes of many critics, as one of the more versatile performers of his generation. Throughout his career, Sandler has also built an extensive body of production work, developing numerous projects that provided opportunities for his close circle of longtime friends and collaborators, a loyalty that has become almost as much a part of his public persona as his comedy itself. In his personal life, Sandler married actress Jacqueline Titton in 2003, and the couple went on to have 2 daughters together, both of whom have appeared alongside their father in several of his film projects over the years. His voice performance as Count Dracula in Hotel Transylvania allowed him to explore a character defined by warmth, anxiety, and deep paternal love, qualities that resonated strongly with audiences and helped anchor the film's emotional core amid its more chaotic, slapstick comedic elements. Selena Gomez. Selena Gomez, who voiced Mavis, Dracula's spirited teenage daughter, was born on July 22, 1992, in Grand Prairie, Texas. She was named after the celebrated Tejano singer Selena Quintanilla, a fitting tribute given the path Gomez's own life would eventually take. Raised primarily by her mother following her parents' divorce when she was still very young, Gomez grew up in a household of relatively modest means, and she has often spoken candidly about the financial struggles her family faced during her early childhood. Her mother, who had herself pursued acting on a local level, recognized her daughter's talent early on and began taking her to auditions, a decision that would set the course for the rest of Gomez's life. At just 7 years old, Gomez landed a recurring role on the children's television series Barney and Friends, a show that also featured a young Demi Lovato among its cast, and the two would go on to form a friendship that lasted for years afterward. Gomez continued to build her career throughout her childhood and early teenage years, taking on small guest appearances across various television programs before eventually landing the role that would transform her into a household name, the lead role of Alex Russo on the Disney Channel series Wizards of Waverly Place. The show became an enormous success, running for several years and turning Gomez into one of the most recognizable young stars of her generation, admired not just for her acting but for the natural charisma and comedic timing she brought to the role. Alongside her acting career, Gomez also pursued music, first as the lead vocalist of the group Selena Gomez and the Scene, and later as a solo artist, releasing a series of albums that showcased her evolving artistic identity and helped her transition successfully from a child star into an adult recording artist with genuine creative ambition. Her voice work as Mavis in Hotel Transylvania came during a period when Gomez was actively working to expand her range beyond the Disney Channel image that had first made her famous, and the role allowed her to bring both youthful energy and genuine emotional depth to a character caught between loyalty to her father and a growing desire for independence. Themes that in many ways echoed Gomez's own journey of growing up in the public eye. Beyond her entertainment career, Gomez has become known for her openness regarding her personal health struggles, having spoken publicly about living with lupus, an autoimmune condition that required a kidney transplant, as well as her ongoing advocacy for mental health awareness, work that has earned her admiration far beyond her achievements in film and music alone. She has continued to build a diverse career in the years since Hotel Transylvania's release, expanding into television production, entrepreneurship, and further voice acting work across the franchise's sequels, all while maintaining the down-to-earth, relatable public persona that first endeared her to audiences during her earliest days on children's television. Andy Samberg. Andy Samberg, who brought the free-spirited human backpacker Jonathan to life, was born on August 18, 1978, in Berkeley, California. He grew up in a creative household, and from a young age displayed an interest in comedy and filmmaking, often making short videos with friends throughout his childhood and teenage years. Samberg attended UC Santa Cruz before transferring to New York University, where he studied filmmaking at the Tisch School of the Arts, the very same program that had once shaped Adam Sandler's own path years earlier. While at NYU, Samberg formed a close creative partnership with fellow students Akiva Schaffer and Jorma Taccone, and together the trio began producing short comedic videos under the name The Lonely Island, a collaboration that would go on to define a significant portion of Samberg's early career. After college, the group relocated to Los Angeles, where they continued developing their comedic sensibility, eventually catching the attention of Saturday Night Live producers. Samberg joined the cast of Saturday Night Live in 2005, quickly becoming known for his digital short film segments, comedic music videos produced alongside his Lonely Island collaborators that blended absurdist humor with genuine musical craftsmanship. These digital shorts became a cultural phenomenon, helping to redefine how sketch comedy could be produced and distributed in the Internet era, and cementing Samberg's reputation as one of the most innovative comedic voices to emerge from the show in years. During his time on Saturday Night Live, Samberg developed a distinctive comedic persona characterized by an easygoing, slightly goofy charm, a quality that translated naturally into his work as Jonathan in Hotel Transylvania, a character defined by wide-eyed curiosity and an almost reckless enthusiasm for adventure. After leaving Saturday Night Live, Samberg continued to build a successful career across film and television, eventually landing one of his most beloved roles as Detective Jake Peralta on the ensemble comedy series Brooklyn Nine-Nine, a role that showcased his ability to anchor a long-running ensemble show while still bringing his signature comedic energy to nearly every scene. Samberg has continued to work extensively across film, television, and digital media in the years since, maintaining his creative partnership with The Lonely Island while also branching out into more varied and occasionally more dramatic projects. In his personal life, Samberg married musician Joanna Newsom in 2013, and the couple has since had children together, with Samberg generally maintaining a fairly private personal life relative to the very public nature of much of his comedic work. Kevin James. Kevin James, who voiced the good-natured and clumsy Frankenstein's monster known as Frank, was born on April 26, 1965, in Mineola, New York, and raised on Long Island in a working-class household. Before pursuing comedy professionally, James worked a variety of jobs, including time spent in construction and other manual labor positions, experiences that would later inform the relatable, everyman quality that became central to his comedic persona. He began performing stand-up comedy in his 20s, gradually building a following through his energetic, physically expressive style of comedy, which often drew on observations about everyday domestic life, marriage, and the general absurdities of adulthood. His stand-up career eventually led to television opportunities, and James found mainstream success as the star of the long-running sitcom The King of Queens, in which he played a lovable, somewhat bumbling delivery driver navigating married life in the Queens borough of New York City. The show ran for 9 seasons and helped establish James as one of the most recognizable comedic actors on television during that era, admired for his ability to combine broad physical comedy with a genuine warmth that made his characters consistently likable despite their frequent misadventures. Following the conclusion of The King of Queens, James transitioned into a prolific film career, frequently collaborating with fellow comedic actor Adam Sandler across numerous projects, a partnership that would eventually bring him to Hotel Transylvania as well. His voice work as Frank required him to bring a certain gentle, oversized charm to a character built around comedic physical clumsiness, and James's naturally warm comedic sensibility proved well suited to a monster whose imposing size belied a fundamentally kind and loyal personality. Beyond his work in comedy, James has also ventured into more dramatic and action-oriented roles throughout his career, demonstrating a range that extends beyond the broad comedic style that first made him famous. He has continued to remain active across film, television, and stand-up comedy in the years since, maintaining the relatable, family-oriented comedic voice that has defined his career from its earliest days. Fran Drescher. Fran Drescher, who voiced Frank's boisterous wife Eunice, was born on September 30, 1957, in Flushing, Queens, New York, and grew up in a Jewish family on Long Island. Drescher developed an interest in performing from a young age, and her distinctive, instantly recognizable voice, nasal and unmistakably New York in its cadence, would go on to become one of the defining features of her entire career. She began her career with small television and film roles throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, gradually building a reputation as a memorable comedic character actress before eventually creating and starring in the role that would define her career, the sitcom The Nanny, which premiered in 1993. In the show, Drescher played Fran Fine, a Queens-born nanny who finds herself working for a wealthy Broadway producer, a premise that allowed her to showcase both her comedic timing and her larger-than-life personality across 6 successful seasons. The Nanny became a genuine cultural phenomenon, and Drescher's voice and comedic style became instantly recognizable to audiences around the world, making her one of the most distinctive comedic performers of the 1990s. Beyond her acting career, Drescher has also become a significant public figure through her advocacy work, particularly following her own diagnosis with uterine cancer in the early 2000s, an experience that led her to become a prominent advocate for cancer awareness and early detection, work that has earned her considerable recognition and respect beyond the entertainment industry alone. Her voice work as Eunice in Hotel Transylvania allowed her to bring her signature boisterous, larger-than-life comedic energy to an animated character, a natural fit given how much of Drescher's career had already been built around a similarly loud, warm, and unmistakably distinctive comedic persona. Drescher has continued to remain active in entertainment and advocacy work in the years since, including further leadership roles within the entertainment industry's labor organizations, reflecting a career that has extended well beyond her original breakthrough as a beloved sitcom star. Steve Buscemi. Steve Buscemi, who lent his voice to Wayne, the harried werewolf father managing an enormous litter of pups, was born on December 13, 1957, in Brooklyn, New York, and raised in Long Island. Before pursuing acting professionally, Buscemi worked for several years as a New York City firefighter, a job he held throughout much of his 20s while simultaneously pursuing stand-up comedy and acting on the side. This background as a firefighter would later become a significant part of his public identity, particularly following the September 11th attacks, when Buscemi returned to his old firehouse to volunteer in the recovery efforts, a gesture that earned him widespread admiration and respect far beyond his already considerable reputation as an actor. Buscemi's acting career began to take shape throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, as he became closely associated with independent filmmaking, developing a reputation for taking on distinctive, often eccentric character roles that showcased a unique blend of nervous energy, dark humor, and genuine emotional depth. His collaborations with prominent independent filmmakers throughout this period helped establish him as one of the most respected character actors of his generation, admired for his willingness to take on unconventional roles that other actors might have avoided. Buscemi's distinctive look and voice, often utilized for characters who were somewhat off-kilter or morally ambiguous, made him a favorite among directors looking for performers capable of bringing genuine nuance to complicated characters. In addition to his acting work, Buscemi has also built a respected career as a director, working across both film and television, including numerous acclaimed television series where his directorial sensibilities proved just as distinctive as his on-screen performances. His voice role as Wayne in Hotel Transylvania represented something of a departure from his more typical dramatic and independent film work, allowing him to showcase a lighter, more overtly comedic side of his range, playing an exhausted but loving father figure trying to manage the chaos of his enormous werewolf family. Buscemi has continued to work extensively across film, television, and voice acting in the years since, maintaining his reputation as one of the most versatile and respected character actors working in American entertainment. Molly Shannon. Molly Shannon, who voiced Wanda, Wayne's equally overwhelmed werewolf wife, was born on September 16, 1964, in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Shannon experienced significant tragedy early in her life, losing her mother and younger sister in a car accident when she was just 4 years old, an experience that she has spoken about candidly in later interviews as having profoundly shaped her outlook and eventually her approach to comedy. Despite this early loss, Shannon developed a passion for performing throughout her childhood and teenage years, eventually studying theater at New York University, once again placing her within the same academic lineage that had shaped several of her future Hotel Transylvania castmates. Shannon began her career with small television and film roles throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s before joining the cast of Saturday Night Live in 1995, where she would go on to spend 6 seasons developing a series of memorable and often wildly energetic characters. Her most famous creation from this period, an eccentric and enthusiastic Catholic schoolgirl character, became one of the most beloved recurring sketches of the era, showcasing Shannon's fearless commitment to physical comedy and her willingness to fully commit to characters who were often as emotionally vulnerable as they were outwardly ridiculous. After leaving Saturday Night Live, Shannon transitioned into a prolific film and television career, taking on a wide variety of comedic and increasingly dramatic roles that showcased a range extending well beyond her most famous sketch comedy work. Her voice performance as Wanda in Hotel Transylvania allowed her to bring her characteristic manic energy to an animated character defined by the chaos of raising an enormous litter of werewolf children, a role that made effective use of her gift for portraying characters perpetually on the verge of delightful overwhelm. In the years since, Shannon has continued to build an increasingly respected and varied career, taking on both comedic and dramatic roles across film and television that have earned her recognition as one of the more versatile performers to emerge from her Saturday Night Live generation. David Spade. David Spade, who voiced the sardonic Invisible Man character Griffin, was born on July 22, 1964, in Birmingham, Michigan, though he was largely raised in Scottsdale, Arizona, following his parents' divorce when he was young. Spade developed an interest in stand-up comedy during his college years, eventually dropping out to pursue comedy professionally, performing throughout comedy clubs before eventually catching the attention of talent scouts who recognized his distinctive, dryly sarcastic comedic voice. Spade joined the cast of Saturday Night Live in 1990, the same general era that produced Adam Sandler, and quickly became known for his sharp, deadpan comedic delivery, a style that stood in playful contrast to some of his more broadly physical castmates. During his time on the show, Spade became particularly well known for a recurring sketch in which he played a dismissive, sarcastic receptionist, a character whose cutting one-liners became instantly quotable among audiences and helped establish the sarcastic, quick-witted comedic persona that would define much of Spade's subsequent career. Following his departure from Saturday Night Live, Spade transitioned into film and television, frequently collaborating with several of his former SNL castmates, including Adam Sandler, across numerous comedic film projects throughout the following decades. He also starred in his own successful television sitcom during the 2000s, further cementing his reputation as a comedic actor whose sarcastic, self-deprecating humor resonated with audiences across both television and film. His voice work as Griffin in Hotel Transylvania proved a particularly fitting match for his comedic sensibilities, given that the character, being invisible for much of the film, relied almost entirely on vocal delivery and comedic timing rather than physical performance, playing directly into Spade's greatest comedic strengths. Spade has continued to remain active across film, television, and podcasting in the years since, maintaining the dry, sarcastic comedic voice that has defined his career since his earliest days on Saturday Night Live. CeeLo Green. CeeLo Green, born Thomas DeCarlo Calloway on May 30, 1974, in Atlanta, Georgia, lent his distinctive voice to Murray the Mummy. Long before his work in Hotel Transylvania, Green built his reputation as one of the most soulful and versatile voices in contemporary music, first gaining prominence as a member of the Atlanta-based hip-hop group Goodie Mob during the 1990s, a group whose socially conscious lyrics and distinctive sound helped establish the Southern hip-hop scene as a major creative force within the broader genre. Following his work with Goodie Mob, Green went on to form the duo Gnarls Barkley alongside producer Danger Mouse, and the pairing achieved massive international success with their breakout single, a song that topped charts around the world and showcased Green's remarkable vocal range, capable of shifting effortlessly between soulful crooning and more energetic, genre-bending performances. Green's solo career further cemented his reputation as one of the most distinctive vocalists of his generation, blending elements of soul, funk, hip-hop, and pop into a sound that proved difficult to categorize but immediately recognizable once heard. Beyond his recording career, Green became a familiar television presence as a coach on the singing competition series The Voice, where his colorful personality and genuine warmth toward contestants made him a fan-favorite presence on the show for several seasons. His voice work as Murray the Mummy in Hotel Transylvania allowed him to bring his naturally warm, charismatic vocal presence to an animated character known for his laid-back, cheerful demeanor despite centuries spent wrapped in bandages, a role that suited Green's genuine, easygoing screen and vocal presence well. Green has continued to work across music, television, and occasional acting projects in the years since, maintaining his reputation as one of the more musically adventurous and vocally distinctive performers to emerge from the Atlanta music scene. Jon Lovitz. Jon Lovitz, who voiced the eccentric, food-obsessed hotel chef Quasimodo, was born on July 21, 1957, in Tarzana, California. Lovitz developed an interest in acting and comedy from a young age, eventually studying theater at UC Irvine before pursuing comedy professionally throughout the Los Angeles club circuit during the early 1980s. His talent for character-based comedy eventually led to him joining the cast of Saturday Night Live in 1985, where he quickly became one of the show's standout performers throughout the latter half of that decade, developing a series of memorable recurring characters known for their exaggerated theatricality and distinctive vocal patterns. Among his most beloved creations from this era was a wildly dramatic, self-aggrandizing actor character whose theatrical monologues and exaggerated mannerisms became one of the most quoted and imitated sketches of the period, showcasing Lovitz's particular gift for characters who combined genuine comedic absurdity with an underlying vulnerability that made them oddly endearing despite their outsized personalities. Following his departure from Saturday Night Live, Lovitz built a prolific career across film, television, and voice acting, becoming particularly well known for his extensive work in animation, where his distinctive, instantly recognizable voice made him a favorite choice for a wide range of comedic characters across numerous television series and films throughout the following decades. His voice work as Quasimodo in Hotel Transylvania made effective use of this animation experience, bringing a manic, food-obsessed energy to a character whose culinary ambitions frequently veered into comedic disaster, a role well suited to Lovitz's gift for portraying characters whose enthusiasm consistently outpaced their competence in the most endearing possible way. Lovitz has continued to remain active across film, television, voice acting, and stand-up comedy in the years since, maintaining a career defined by the same theatrical, larger-than-life comedic energy that first made him a standout performer during his years on Saturday Night Live. A closer look at the paths that led them here. What makes the voice cast of Hotel Transylvania particularly fascinating is not simply the individual accomplishments of each performer, but the way their very different paths through comedy and entertainment eventually converged on this single animated project. Adam Sandler's journey from a broke, nervous stand-up comedian performing for $10 a night in New York clubs to one of the most bankable comedic stars in Hollywood history represents one of the more remarkable trajectories in modern entertainment, and his choice to lend his voice, and by extension his enormous box office draw, to an original animated concept rather than an established franchise reflected a certain confidence in the project's creative team, a confidence that would prove well-founded once the film became a genuine commercial phenomenon. Sandler's approach to voice acting, much like his approach to live-action comedy, tends to favor a naturalistic, almost conversational delivery, and this quality translated well into Dracula, a character who needed to feel simultaneously larger than life, given his centuries of accumulated experience and legendary status, and deeply relatable, given his very ordinary anxieties as a father. Selena Gomez's involvement in the project came at a particularly pivotal moment in her own career, as she balanced the ongoing final seasons of the Disney Channel series that had made her famous with an increasingly ambitious slate of film and music projects designed to showcase her range beyond her earlier, more family-friendly image. Voicing Mavis allowed her to explore themes of independence and self-discovery that mirrored her own real-life transition from a carefully managed child star into an artist increasingly in control of her own creative direction. And the emotional authenticity she brought to the role helped ground the film's more fantastical elements in something genuinely relatable for younger audience members navigating their own journeys toward independence. Andy Samberg's casting as Jonathan reflected the particular comedic sensibility he had spent years cultivating alongside his Lonely Island collaborators, a sensibility built around embracing absurdity with total sincerity rather than ironic detachment. This quality proved essential to making Jonathan work as a character, since the role required an actor capable of playing genuine wonder and excitement at increasingly ridiculous circumstances without ever tipping into parody or condescension toward the material. Samberg's naturally warm, slightly goofy vocal delivery gave Jonathan an authenticity that helped audiences believe in his budding connection with Mavis, even amid the film's more chaotic comedic sequences. Kevin James, meanwhile, brought to Frank a comedic sensibility rooted in years of playing lovable, well-meaning characters whose good intentions often outpaced their competence, a dynamic that had defined much of his television and film work throughout the preceding decade. His voice work required a particular kind of gentle, oversized warmth, conveying Frank's imposing physical stature while maintaining the character's fundamentally sweet and loyal nature, a balance James had spent years perfecting across his broader body of comedic work. Fran Drescher's casting as Eunice took full advantage of one of the most recognizable voices in American comedy, a voice so distinctive that animators reportedly found it relatively straightforward to design Eunice's exaggerated expressions and mannerisms around the natural rhythms and inflections of Drescher's speech patterns. Her decades of experience playing bold, unapologetically loud characters translated seamlessly into animation, where her vocal choices could exist without any of the physical or visual constraints that might have limited a similarly styled live-action performance. Steve Buscemi's involvement in the project represented an interesting departure from the type of independent film and character work that had defined much of his career up to that point. And his casting as Wayne demonstrated the growing recognition among animation studios that performers known primarily for dramatic or morally complex roles could bring a surprising and effective comedic energy to family-friendly animated projects when given the right material. Buscemi's natural vocal cadence, often associated with nervous, high-strung characters throughout his live-action career, translated perfectly into Wayne's constant state of exhausted parental overwhelm, managing an enormous litter of chaotic werewolf children. Molly Shannon's casting as Wanda similarly drew on her decades of experience playing characters defined by barely contained energy and enthusiasm, qualities that had made her such a memorable presence during her years on Saturday Night Live. Her ability to convey both genuine warmth and comedic exasperation made her an ideal match for a character constantly caught between affection for her enormous family and the sheer chaos of managing them. David Spade's casting as Griffin the Invisible Man proved almost inevitable given the character's fundamental nature, since a character defined entirely by sound rather than visual presence naturally called for a performer whose comedic strength lay primarily in vocal delivery and timing rather than physical performance, and Spade's sharp, sardonic comedic voice, honed over decades of stand-up and sketch comedy, gave Griffin a distinctive comedic personality despite his literal invisibility on screen. CeeLo Green's involvement in the project brought a different kind of star power to the ensemble, one rooted in music rather than traditional film and television comedy, and his warm, richly textured voice gave Murray the Mummy a laid-back, soulful quality that stood out among the more overtly comedic vocal performances surrounding him. Green's natural charisma, already well established through his music career and his television work as a coach on a major singing competition series, translated smoothly into an animated context, giving Murray a coolness and warmth that helped balance out some of the film's more manic comedic energy. Jon Lovitz, meanwhile, brought decades of specifically animation-focused vocal experience to his role as Quasimodo, having spent much of the years following his Saturday Night Live tenure building a substantial career specifically within voice acting for both television and film. This experience gave him a particular facility for finding comedic timing purely through vocal performance, a skill clearly on display in Quasimodo's manic, food-obsessed energy throughout the film. The broader context of each performer's career. Looking at the broader arc of each performer's career reveals just how much collective comedic history went into bringing Hotel Transylvania to life. Sandler, Spade, Shannon, and Lovitz each represent different eras of Saturday Night Live, a show that has served for decades as one of the most significant incubators of American comedic talent, and their collective presence in a single animated film speaks to the show's enduring influence across generations of performers. Kevin James and Fran Drescher, meanwhile, represent the particular comedic tradition of long-running network sitcoms built around distinctive, larger-than-life lead performances, a tradition that dominated American television comedy throughout the 1990s and early 2000s and that shaped an entire generation of viewers' expectations for what a beloved comedic lead character should look and sound like. Steve Buscemi's presence within this otherwise broadly comedic ensemble reflects animation's growing willingness throughout the 2000s and 2010s to cast performers primarily known for dramatic or independent work in family-friendly comedic projects, a trend that allowed animated films to access a wider and more unexpected range of vocal talent than had traditionally been the case. Selena Gomez and Andy Samberg, meanwhile, represented something of a younger generation within the ensemble, performers who had built their early careers within the frameworks of Disney Channel programming and internet-native sketch comedy respectively, mediums that had only fully come into their own during the years immediately preceding the film's production. This generational and stylistic diversity ultimately proved to be one of the film's greatest strengths, giving each character within the sprawling ensemble of monster guests a genuinely distinct comedic voice and personality, rather than allowing the film's large cast to blur together into an undifferentiated mass of comedic archetypes. Each performer brought not just their vocal talent but their accumulated decades of comedic instinct and timing to characters that, on paper, might have simply existed as visual gags built around classic monster movie iconography. Instead, thanks to the specific choices and comedic sensibilities each actor brought to their respective roles, characters like Frank, Eunice, Wayne, Wanda, Griffin, Murray, and Quasimodo each emerged as genuinely memorable personalities in their own right, contributing to a film whose ensemble cast became just as beloved among audiences as its central father-daughter storyline. The ensemble behind the magic. Taken together, the voice cast of Hotel Transylvania represents a genuinely remarkable convergence of comedic talents spanning multiple generations of American comedy, from Saturday Night Live veterans like Sandler, Spade, Shannon, and Lovitz, to beloved sitcom stars like James and Drescher, to a celebrated independent film character actor in Buscemi, a chart-topping musical talent in CeeLo Green, and a rising young star in Selena Gomez who was, at the time of the film's release, actively transitioning from a beloved child performer into a fully realized adult entertainer in her own right. Andy Samberg, meanwhile, brought his own distinctive digital-era comedic sensibility to the project, having helped redefine sketch comedy for an entirely new generation of internet audiences during his own tenure on Saturday Night Live. This blending of comedic backgrounds, spanning stand-up, sketch comedy, sitcom television, independent film, and music, gave Hotel Transylvania a voice cast with genuine chemistry and range, each performer bringing their own distinctive comedic sensibility to a colorful ensemble of monster characters, ultimately helping to elevate the film beyond a simple animated comedy into something with genuine warmth, humor, and heart, anchored by performers who had each, in their own way, spent decades building the kind of comedic instincts necessary to bring such a wildly varied cast of characters believably and hilariously to life. It is also worth appreciating just how much individual life experience, hardship, reinvention, and personal growth sits behind each of these performances. Sandler's journey from a stage-frightened teenager performing for pocket change to one of the most recognizable comedic voices in the world speaks to a persistence that shaped his entire approach to character work. Gomez's balancing act between fame achieved as a child and the desire to be taken seriously as an adult artist, all while navigating significant personal health challenges in the years that followed, gives her performance as Mavis, a character also caught between inherited expectation and personal desire, an unusually resonant subtext. Samberg's rise through a self-made internet comedy collective before landing on one of television's most established stages reflects the changing landscape of how comedic careers could be built during the early 2000s. James and Drescher both spent years building recognition through the specific discipline of network television sitcoms, a format that rewards consistency, likability, and the ability to sustain a single character's charm across hundreds of episodes, skills that translated naturally into voice work requiring sustained character consistency across an entire feature film. Buscemi's background as a working firefighter before finding acting success grounds his entire career in a kind of lived authenticity that even his most eccentric characters seem to carry. Shannon's early loss and the resilience she built in its aftermath informed a comedic style that has always carried genuine emotional vulnerability beneath its more manic surface. Spade's dry, observational wit was sharpened over years of stand-up before ever reaching television, giving his delivery a precision that reads clearly even without any visual performance attached to it. Green's path through Southern hip-hop, genre-bending duo work, and solo music stardom before ever setting foot in a recording booth for an animated film demonstrates just how far a distinctive voice alone can carry a career across entirely different mediums. And Lovitz's years spent building a reputation specifically within animation, following his own Saturday Night Live breakout, reflect an actor who recognized early on the particular power and longevity that voice work can offer a comedic performer. Together, these 10 performers, each shaped by distinctly different upbringings, comedic traditions, and career paths, brought a level of craft and lived experience to Hotel Transylvania that helped elevate it well beyond a simple collection of monster-themed sight gags. Their combined body of work, spanning stand-up clubs, network sitcoms, sketch comedy stages, independent film sets, and recording studios, ultimately gave the film's colorful cast of characters a depth and believability that continues to resonate with audiences long after the closing credits roll. If you enjoyed learning about the incredible casts behind Hotel Transylvania, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to Review and Facts for more detailed breakdowns just like this one. Hotel Transylvania, 2012, the making of the movie, its budget, and the funniest moments behind the scenes. The long and troubled road to the screen. Before Hotel Transylvania ever became the beloved animated hit audiences know today, it endured one of the longer and more chaotic development journeys in modern animated filmmaking. The project first entered development at Sony Pictures Animation all the way back in 2006, years before a single frame of the finished film would ever reach theaters. What followed was a genuinely turbulent stretch of production limbo, during which the film cycled through an extraordinary number of directors, writers, and creative visions, none of which ever quite managed to stick. By the time the project finally landed in the hands of the director audiences now associate with the finished film, it had already passed through the hands of no fewer than 5 previous directors, each bringing their own ideas, their own tone, and their own version of what this monster comedy might eventually become, only to eventually move on or be moved off the project as Sony continued searching for the right creative fit. This kind of extended development limbo is not entirely uncommon in the world of big-budget animation, where the sheer complexity, cost, and time investment required to produce a feature-length computer-animated film often means studios take a cautious, sometimes indecisive approach before fully committing to a final creative direction. But even by those standards, Hotel Transylvania's road to the screen was unusually long and unusually bumpy, spending roughly 5 years cycling through different creative visions before the project finally found its footing. It was not until 2011, a full 5 years after development first began, that the studio brought on the director who would ultimately shape the film into the version audiences would come to know and love, a television animation veteran stepping into his very first feature directing role, inheriting a project that had already accumulated years of false starts, script rewrites, and shifting creative direction. By his own admission, walking into the production at that stage felt less like joining a well-organized film set and more like stepping directly into the middle of a chaotic battlefield. The director later described the experience of arriving on a project already 5 years deep into development, one that had cycled through so many previous creative visions, as genuinely overwhelming, a stark contrast to the more contained, tightly run television animation productions he had spent the majority of his career working within. Rather than starting fresh with a blank page, he found himself inheriting years of accumulated material, decisions, and expectations, all of which needed to be reconciled into a single coherent creative vision in a fraction of the time a project of this scale would typically be afforded. A director under pressure and a race against the clock. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hotel Transylvania's production, once its director finally came aboard, was just how little time remained to actually complete the film. Having joined the project roughly 18 months before its eventual theatrical release, and with years of prior development still needing to be sorted through, refined, or discarded entirely, the production team found itself working under an extraordinarily compressed schedule for a major studio animated feature. The visual effects supervisor overseeing the project's technical execution later described the timeline bluntly, noting that the team essentially had less than a single year to bring the entire film to completion once the creative direction had finally been locked into place, a genuinely daunting proposition for a project of this scale and ambition. This compressed schedule created enormous pressure throughout every department involved in the film's production, from story and character design through animation, lighting, rendering, and final post-production polish. Teams that might typically be afforded several years to fully realize a major studio animated feature instead found themselves racing against an unusually tight clock, making creative and technical decisions at a pace far faster than industry norms typically allowed. Remarkably, despite this immense time pressure, the production team managed to deliver a finished film that not only met its release date but went on to become a genuine commercial phenomenon, a testament to the skill, dedication, and occasionally frantic problem-solving of everyone involved in bringing the project across the finish line. The pressure of this compressed schedule reportedly pushed the newly arrived director to his breaking point on more than one occasion during the earliest stages of production. In candid remarks shared publicly after the film's completion, he admitted that early in the process, following a particularly frustrating meeting that highlighted just how different the culture of big studio feature production was from the more contained television animation environment he had spent his career working within, he seriously considered walking away from the project entirely. It was only after recognizing the unique opportunity his position afforded him, the chance to direct his very first feature film for a major studio, that he found the resolve to push through the frustration, learning along the way when it made sense to stand firm on his creative vision and when compromise would ultimately serve the project better. Reimagining what computer animation could look like. One of the defining creative goals the director brought to Hotel Transylvania stemmed directly from his extensive background in traditional, hand-drawn television animation, a background that had shaped his entire approach to visual comedy long before he ever set foot on a computer-animated production. Rather than simply adopting the increasingly standardized, realism-focused visual language that had come to dominate most major studio computer-animated films throughout the preceding decade, he set out to infuse Hotel Transylvania with the exaggerated, physics-defying energy of classic hand-drawn cartoon comedy, drawing significant inspiration from the legendary animation pioneer Tex Avery, whose wildly exaggerated, gravity-defying visual gags had helped define an entire era of theatrical cartoon shorts decades earlier. This creative choice represented a genuinely bold departure from prevailing industry trends at the time, given that the broader computer animation marketplace had increasingly gravitated toward more grounded, physically realistic character movement and rendering techniques throughout the years leading up to Hotel Transylvania's release. Bringing a more elastic, cartoony sensibility into a fully three-dimensional computer-animated production required the animation team to essentially reinvent certain technical and artistic approaches, finding ways to make characters stretch, squash, and exaggerate their movements in ways that felt more akin to classic two-dimensional cartoon comedy than the increasingly realistic character animation that had become the default approach across much of the industry. The director spoke candidly about the pressures of working within a marketplace that increasingly demanded computer-generated visuals, acknowledging that while he personally still held a deep affection for traditional two-dimensional animation, the commercial realities of the modern industry made pursuing a large-scale two-dimensional feature an increasingly risky proposition, leading him to instead pour his traditional animation sensibilities into reshaping what a computer-animated film could look and feel like instead. This ambition extended beyond simple visual style into the very structure of how scenes were staged and how comedic timing was constructed throughout the film. Sequences were built with an eye toward maximizing physical comedy and visual gags, favoring dynamic, high-energy staging over the more static, dialogue-heavy scenes that had become common across much of contemporary computer animation. This approach would go on to become something of a signature across the director's subsequent work on the franchise's sequels as well, with later installments continuing to push even further into physically driven, visually inventive comedic sequences built specifically to showcase the kind of exaggerated character animation that had first drawn him to the project's creative possibilities in the first place.